By MPT to serve all of our diverse communities and is made possible by the generous support of our members. Thank you. Live from Maryland Public Television, this is Direct Connection with Jeff Salkin.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in for Direct Connection. Just a game, maybe two, left in the 2016 World Series. Game 6 is tomorrow in Cleveland. Now, for fans of the Orioles and the Nationals, successful seasons ended with playoff games, but maybe not enough of them. Our focus tonight is both baseball and the future of Baltimore. Our guest is John Angelos, Chief Operating Officer of both the Baltimore Orioles and the Mid-Atlantic Sports Network, or MASN. John, thank you for being with us.
Pleasure to be here, Jeff.
In terms of baseball, things are reasonably good. 3 of the last 5 years made the playoffs. And how do you look at the offseason?
3 of the last 5 years in the playoffs, Buck Showalter and Dan Duquette have been doing a great job. I think someone in the media reminded me or us the other day that the club under Buck has had the winningest record in the American League the last 5 years, and that's
total
overall, right?
Wow.
And, but no championship yet. The division title and a couple other appearances, but I think that's certainly where we want to be. I think we're the ownership group that my father and other local folks put together. The goal is to be in contention, and you hope eventually, through enough years of contention, you get to that place of a world championship.
Baseball operates differently than football, where there's a salary cap and it's designed more for parity. In baseball, you have the opportunity for certain really large market teams to spend way more money.
You do. If you lay the 4 major sports leagues next to one another and look at the comparative business models, they're different. And baseball is one that really allows for a lot more imbalance, and that makes it a challenge for middle and small market clubs. The NFL has a very elegant solution where they take away a lot of the imbalance. They sort of normalize for different size markets and different ownership groups so that the fans get the most competitiveness, and I think they feel that grows the league around the country in the best fashion. If one asked me, and after several decades in sports and entertainment, I would say they've got a pretty good model, and we should move a little more towards that. Baseball
has a little bit of that, if I'm not mistaken. There's some sort of penalty on having the richest payroll. Is there still, or? There is. There's a luxury tax, and I think a luxury tax has a minimal deterring effect on clubs. It really would have more of an impact. There's also revenue sharing to try and normalize, and we have that in baseball. The incongruity of one club with a $300 million payroll, another with a $60 million payroll, and sort of a crooked graph line in between makes those types of mechanisms not as effective as you probably need. Now, the Orioles, Baltimore as a city is like a mid-20s media market. In terms of baseball payroll, though, you rank much higher. We have recently, and in part that's a function of the ownership group wanting to make that investment and continuing to be competitive and in contention. It's also a function of success. As you're successful, your younger players will be in line to make significantly more dollars, and unless the ownership were to choose at a particular club to trade those players and instead reinvest in those players, your payroll is going to go up. So our payroll from 5 years ago is virtually doubled. Let's set baseball aside for a minute, and I want to come back to it. But the other thing that I know you're highly interested in is Baltimore City and the future of the city. And last baseball season, we had that game with an empty stadium. In the aftermath of the disturbances after the death of Freddie Gray, there was a day where a game needed to be played. It wasn't going to be possible for police to provide full security, so there was nobody there. And it really, in part, helped the nation, I think, focus attention on the needs of Baltimore. What do you see in terms of those needs and what the solutions could be? Well, I think certainly what began with a what was a personal and a family tragedy for the Freddie Gray family, and then mushroomed into many other subsequent events in terms of social disturbance and protests, many of which were peaceful, and obviously a lot of the media attention focused on some of the not peaceful demonstrations. What I think that showed last year or 16 months ago is what I think many people knew over the last 2 to 4 decades, which is there is a sequential cause and effect relationship. As high-paying, highly valued jobs, particularly those in the manufacturing industries, which are industries that can employ a lot of people who perhaps don't have the highest educational levels, and some that do. As those jobs are exported, or as the phrasing sometimes goes, offshored or globalized, the standard of living in that community falls. As that happens, you have greater evidence of, or greater instance of crime and other social ills, drug addiction, and so forth. And as that happens, you will sometimes have conflicts between the police and the citizenry for a variety of reasons.
We saw in this political campaign, we've seen a lot of things in this political campaign, but one of the things was a move really on both sides of the spectrum, anti-globalization, more protectionism. Is that the answer?
Well, I think there are differing views on that, and I think it's sort of interesting that those who have rallied behind, rather belatedly, the ideas of repatriating jobs. In many ways, one might suggest that the Democratic Party historically vacated their obligation to working groups and to push for keeping jobs in this country, and only because of that vacating of that obligation have now certain groups, such as the Republicans, and rallied around that cause, a cause that they largely, with certain exceptions, didn't embrace for a long time.
This is an interesting town to look at the globalization argument, because you have the Port of Baltimore, which directly and indirectly is tens of thousands of jobs, a lot of union jobs, and you see these ships coming in and leaving now. They tend to come in full and leave half empty on their way back to Asia, but still both sides of that argument are represented within the limits of Baltimore City.
Yeah, I think so. When you say both sides of the argument are represented,
well, the idea that global trade lifts all boats. There's rising seas there from having a more open borders, lower tariffs. At the same time, the manufacturing has all gone away. The other side of that is that if the manufacturing were to come back, you have, say, a plant which had maybe 1,000 people working there, and it moved to Mexico. If you could somehow legislate that it had to come back, the 1,000 jobs wouldn't necessarily come back. It would be more automated, and maybe there'd be 100 jobs. So the issue is fairly complex.
Well, it absolutely can be. I think the history of it is more important in terms of looking at what is the future going to be. What are we going to learn from the history? If we look at the history as, well, it was inevitable that those jobs would be lost first to places like Japan, and then Korea, and then later to China. And if one were to conclude that that were necessarily a net good thing, that might not be the right conclusion. Yeah, I think you also have to look at, well, are you going to have free trade or fair trade, and who is your trading partner? On the one hand, we from a foreign policy standpoint have over the last 40 years taken the position that a totalitarian political entity, like say China, is someone that we philosophically differ with. Yet on the other hand, we're perfectly comfortable from a trade policy standpoint moving our homegrown jobs there. Some might say that those two policies are in conflict.
We've gotten a long way from baseball.
We have.
Haven't we? Let me remind our viewers, if you have a question for John Angelos about Baltimore baseball or Baltimore the city, give us a call. We'll have the number up on the screen. You can also tweet your questions. Our Twitter address is @MPT News. So you have this powerful business in the Orioles in terms of being able to make a difference in Baltimore, the lives of families. How does the organization approach that?
Well, our ownership group is made up of a good number of really well-known Maryland folks who care a lot about Baltimore and Maryland. The original group, as I think you know many of them, my father and Tom Clancy, Jim McKay, Pam Shriver, Barry Levinson, a number of other people that grew up here and then went off in a variety of directions and did a lot of good things personally, but always felt that owning the Orioles, keeping the Orioles in local ownership hands, and using it as a platform for civic and charitable good. And you think about the different groups that have owned the club, beginning with the Hofberger family, who were local owners, Edward Bennett Williams, Eli Jacobs, and now this group of Marylanders. The question is not, ownership changes. You're really just a steward of the club. So using the club for reinforcing good messages, charitable giving, certainly baseball with a model where 75 million people will come to a Major League Baseball game this year. Another 35 million will come to a minor league game. It's 110 million people. That's a very big tent model. You've got people from all walks of life, young and old, different economic levels. That's really a platform to do a lot of good and send out a lot of good messaging. So Orioles Reach, Orioles Foundation, programs to bring disadvantaged kids, support literacy programs, support the school system, support every charitable program with whom we can partner. The Ravens do that, all the clubs do that, but I think that's certainly a mantra of this ownership group and has been for the last 23 years.
The thing Adam Jones said in passing about baseball being a white man's game, and it was in the context of the symbolic moves that some NFL players have made in terms of sitting out the national anthem, taking a knee, raising a fist. There is a relatively small number of African-American baseball players. Is it something that Major League Baseball can work on in terms of supporting youth athletics in urban areas?
I just saw Adam recently, a couple weeks ago, and he's a very thoughtful person and cares a lot about his upbringing and where he is today and where he'll be in the future. And I think he's going to continue to be very impactful on the game of baseball for as long as he plays, and then after he retires, which hopefully won't come for some time. You mentioned the context, but let me say something about the racial, the demographic makeup of baseball. It is true that over the last X number of years, the percentage of African-American players has declined. It's also true that the percentage of white players has declined. And the reason for that, to a great degree, is that the percentage of Latin American players and the percentage of Asian players has increased. To use one really telling example, before a player like Ichiro decided a number of years ago that he was going to leave the Japanese league and come to Major League Baseball, there was a spot out of 750 spots for a player who was then replaced by Ichiro. Because he's such a magnificent talent, he comes over and he takes a spot. He might have taken the spot of a white player, an African-American player, a Hispanic player, or another Asian player. But it's competition. As the game has globalized, more players are coming in. You see the players we've had, Asian players, Latin American players, who have taken spots. So that's part of the reason. Another reason is the costly nature of youth baseball, the single sporting by young people, which has affected all team sports. Sports have become more single sport driven and more expensive for the families to afford with all the cottage industries that have grown up around them. And a lot of that really goes back to economics and politics. Why are parents chasing single sporting, high cost youth teams? Because in many cases they're forced to chase college scholarships and financial aid. And that is forced upon families because of the rising cost of college educations in the United States. So there's, again, a connection between sports and the general economic situation.
I hadn't thought about that. I mean, that's a complex trickle down. And you hear that tied into the increase in the number of young pitchers needing elbow surgery as well.
There's no question about it. I watched one youth team of about 15 kids that had 3 young players go down with fractured elbows, growth plate fractures.
Wow.
And the reason was we looked at how much they had pitched, and they were playing the field and pitching. And these young kids, 14 years old, had played over 80 games in a short period of time. And if you adjusted, they had effectively pitched as frequently as an Orioles bullpen pitcher would pitch, and they're 14 years old. So that is another unintended consequence. But, Adam, you mentioned the context. And aside from Adam's comment about the demography, Adam was really talking more in broader strokes about Colin Kaepernick and the issue of violence in urban areas and conflicts between the police and the citizenry. And I think Adam and Colin Kaepernick have made important contributions to the dialogue. Doesn't mean, you necessarily agree, but there was really nothing in it for either of those fellas to put their hat in the ring politically. It's not what they usually do. They do their talking on the field. So when Adam and Colin Kaepernick were brave enough, whether you agree with them or not, to enter into that dialogue, I think you have to acknowledge that the more of us who are talking about these things, the better off we'll be.
Let's grab a phone call. Baltimore City, this is Bill. Bill, thank you for calling. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Angelos and Oriole ownership for stepping up the last few years and putting up the money to retain our key players. But my question is, have the Orioles, and to your knowledge, other American League owners done any advocating with the commissioner of baseball to make the designated hitter rule league-wide?
Great question during the World Series, Bill. Thanks for the phone call.
We have not advocated on one side of that discussion or the other. In my view, questions like that, questions about a similar issue that comes up that I think is somewhat in the same category is, should the winner of the All-Star game determine home field for the World Series? Another timely issue. My personal view on that is that we should let the fans decide. We should do a lot of polling, a lot of focus groups. We should also let the players and the managers and those in the game weigh in on that. It really is. I mentioned the 110 million people that go to a game in a year. It's really the fans' game, and those issues are relative neutral. The union has a position on DHs, and it's understandable. The owners may have one, but at a certain point, the answer to that, or the determination of that, is not going to make or break either the players or the owners. So let's let the fans weigh in more. But no, the Orioles have not advocated on one side or the other.
The caller referenced the amount of money that the Orioles organization has been spending in recent years. Last offseason, I think, was the Chris Davis contract, $160-some million headline number. Two questions. Well, first, the spending over recent years, what's the trend look like? Obviously up, but in terms of like percentage terms, what's happening with payroll? For the Orioles? Yeah.
Well, our payroll over the last 5 years virtually doubled. And that's a product, in our case, of success. Success by the club inevitably or invariably means success by individual performers, and those performances are rewarded in the form of greater arbitration awards for players in the arbitration range, and free agent signings for players like Chris Davis, who became free agent eligible in the midst of that. Great performance by him and great performance by the club. So our payroll, which was down far below where it had been historically in the aftermath of some rebuilding, then as that rebuilding started to pay off in the form of greater competitiveness and then playoff appearances that you mentioned, the players were in line to, and deservedly so, making higher and higher payrolls. Choice for ownership is keep the team together, or in recognition of market size, trade players away. The commitment of the ownership to date has been to keep the team together.
Yeah, I'm just curious about how decisions like that are made on the inside, where you have such huge numbers, and it's either going to be right or wrong. And if it's right, it's terrific. If it's wrong, it's going to hamstring the team for many years to come. And I'm a guy who always picks the wrong line at the supermarket. So there's a lot of pressure in that.
There is, and when you are, in my father's case, he's the managing general partner of an ownership group that he put together, and he has a fiduciary duty to the ownership group and to himself to make sure that he's balancing those issues accordingly. And there's really only one person, man or woman, whoever it may be, in that driver's seat. The rest of us, even whether you're an executive involved as I am, or an observer or a fan, we're all backseat drivers to some extent, because those the pressure is considerable, considerably more than which line to pick at the grocery store, as you jokingly
You're
say.
betting the franchise to some degree.
Yeah, you can be. I mean, obviously, you just saw in San Diego, and not to pick out any one club, where they, a couple years ago, new ownership, bought a lot of free agents or traded for a lot of players, and then took on a huge payroll increase, and then decided that wasn't the direction, that wasn't paying off, and they were able to trade away the contracts, but they had to pay a lot of the salary on the way out, and that's never what you want. So I think that's typically you want to have a total loss when you sign a big contract, but contracts are typically not that portable, so you are making a long-term investment, and you do that hopefully with a lot of due diligence.
Let's grab another phone call. Baltimore County, this is Michael. Michael, thanks for the call. Go ahead.
Yes. First, I'd like to thank you and your group for keeping the team in Baltimore. I was so scared when the Colts left that the Orioles would follow out the door. And I had two questions, one of which relates to ownership. I'm wondering, why aren't there more teams like the Green Bay Packers that are publicly owned? I remember when I was growing up, very little, that the Baltimore Orioles were a publicly traded stock on the local exchange, and anyone could buy shares, although the majority interest was held out. And the other question, again unrelated, is will there be enough money to keep Manny?
That's the big question. Michael, thank you very much. You don't have to, that decision is a year or two off.
That's right.
Maybe closer.
Yes, that's right. Maybe closer. I mean, certainly teams always try to, and ownership groups always try to get ahead on young, top of the league kind of players like Manny and others, where teams will typically go to them early and try to do something. But that process always continues and can go on right through the extent of their 0 to 6 years. Concerning local ownership, I mentioned it before. The actual history of that, as some people recall, is the previous ownership group was in the process of selling the Orioles in 1993.
That was
Mr. Jacobs, yes.
He was a New York financier, no ties to Baltimore.
Right. Mr. Jacobs was, because of some other financial issues that he had, was in the process of selling the Orioles to an out-of-town ownership group. And my father, Mr. Clancy, and our group put together, long before I was involved at this level, put together an effort to urge the bankruptcy court to sell the Orioles to the highest bidder, with the idea that they hoped that they would end up being purchased by a local ownership group. And through an actual, I think the first time, not the last, but the first time, the club was auctioned, essentially a live auction held in a New York City bankruptcy court. And fortunately, our group was the winning bidder, and local ownership was restored to the club.
But your group is not taking the club public, as the caller seemed to. You had a stockholder in waiting there.
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, that was not ever discussed. I think that is obviously the exception that proves the rule. I don't think that's favored in any of the leagues at this point. The league favors a strong control person, preferably a local strong control person of high reputation and high wherewithal, and surrounded by a strong group, which is essentially had a big reason. One of the reasons why our group was able to prevail there, because he put together such a well-known and highly reputed group at that time. And I think the league also many of the leagues have instituted debt equity rules and other requirements that are not altogether consistent with the idea of a publicly owned club.
Right. Plus, all the information is then public, more or less.
So there is that issue too. Now on that, I would say that transparency is a good thing, but I don't disagree. That has been a concern.
Let's grab another call from Sussex County, Delaware. This is John. John, thank you for calling. Go ahead.
Hey, yes. Will Joey Rickard be available for spring training? I know he had a bad thumb or something.
Thanks very much. I was going to stay away from individual players.
That would be. I will profess. That's a Dan Duquette, Buck Showalter question, right. And if you have them on together, they would be better at that. Yeah, that would be great.
Name the date. I wanted to ask about attendance, because the NFL has this issue where their ratings are down for this season. But attendance, I think, is reasonably strong. Baseball, I think attendance was a little bit soft, at least for the Orioles. But the TV ratings were off the charts. Is that about right?
That is about right, yeah. And I think that, a lot of factors. I think we came out relatively late with some of our sales and marketing. In part, we signed Chris Davis relatively late, which is, these things are just the inevitable vagaries and sort of the ebb and flow of an off season. The weather this year, I should have mentioned that first. The weather, especially the April and May weather, was historically and in an unparalleled fashion awful. Baseball tickets are the most difficult to sell in April and September because kids are in school and the weather's not so great. September's more of a function of, are you in contention? We've been in contention, so that's okay. But April and May, and particularly when you have horrid weather, really puts a damper on your sales. I think those factors all sort of figured into sort of a perfect storm of creating a drag on attendance.
And frankly, the TV product is terrific. And when I watch the games on Masson, it's always 70-some degrees in my house and not raining.
That's great. You have a good house.
Let's grab one more call quickly. Montgomery County, this is Tom. Tom, thank you for the call. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to thank your support for UB and Baltimore. And on another question, I just wanted to know why the Baltimore doesn't use the Oakland model about using statistics to govern the team.
Very good question. Thank you. Moneyball. Must do it to some degree.
We do. Oakland and Billy Beane, what he, and the movie and the book, by the way, I read and watched both, respectively, and they were really true to life in bringing out some of the important issues. We do use that. The Oakland was a pioneer, but we do it every day, and Dan and Buck are big advocates.
John Angelos, Chief Operating Officer of the Orioles and Masson, we appreciate your time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us for Direct Connection. We're back Thursday with Your Money in Business. Have a good night.
This program was made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities.